They said Christmas was supposed to bring people together. But that night, the only thing gathered at my father's mansion was arrogance and laughter that stung sharper than winter air. The chandelier lights glistened off silverware polished for people who pretended to pray before quietly tearing one another down. Everyone laughed. Everyone but me. I smiled because that's what polite daughters do when their hearts are breaking in front of a crowd. The sound of forks clinking still echoes in my memory like a sudden cold drop in the orchestra's music. My father loved performances, and humiliation was his favorite scene. He stood at the center of that long mahogany table, his gold cufflinks catching the light as if mocking my husband Liam and me. Liam sat beside me, jaw tight, the muscles in his face frozen somewhere between fury and restraint. I could feel him trembling under the table, not from anger but from shame. He hated that he couldn't give me what my father believed I deserved: money, status, control. What my father never understood was that Liam had given me something he never could: gentleness. "Emma," my father said, loudly sloshing the champagne in his flute. "Do you still live in that little apartment above the coffee shop?" he said, apartment as if it were a disease. "Yes, Dad," I replied, smiling politely. "We like it there. It's home." "Oh, I'm sure it is," he said, smirking. "Though I imagine you'll be downsizing again soon once your artist husband runs out of inspiration or rent money." Laughter. Real sharp, cruel. It sliced through me like a broken shard of their crystal champagne flutes, impossible to remove but piercing all the same. My mother stared into her drink, pretending not to hear. She'd mastered the art of invisibility long ago. Across the table, my sister Lauren rolled her eyes dramatically. "Honestly, Emma, I still don't understand what you saw in him. You could have had anyone. You could have married up." I met her gaze steady. "Maybe I didn't want to marry up," I said softly. "Maybe I wanted to marry right." That silenced her for half a second, long enough for my father to fill the air again. "Marry right," he repeated. "Sweetheart, you married wrong. You traded a future for charity work." More laughter. Liam's hand slipped from mine. That was the moment something inside me split, not in rage but in clarity. There's a kind of pain so clean it cuts away everything false. I looked around the room at the chandeliers, the wine-stained tablecloths, the people who measured love in stock value and bloodline, and I knew I didn't belong to them anymore. Dinner carried on with stories about stock markets, partnerships, politics. My father loved to hear himself talk about his next hostile takeover. He believed power was loud, visible, undeniable. I smiled at his delusion because I'd already learned the truth: real power is quiet. It doesn't announce itself, it signs papers when no one's looking. After dessert, I excused myself to the balcony. Snow drifted down in soft, slow spirals, the city below shimmering with Christmas lights. The laughter inside muffled into a dull hum. Liam joined me, wrapping his coat around my shoulders. "You shouldn't let them get to you," he said. His voice was low, steady, but I could hear the crack in it. "I'm not letting them," I whispered. "I'm remembering them." "For what?" "For later." He stared at me for a long time, searching my face. "You scare me when you talk like that." "I scare myself," I said and smiled. Downstairs, the orchestra began playing a waltz and the guests swirled under golden lights. My father danced with my sister, laughing loud enough for the whole room to hear. I watched them, and for the first time in my life, I felt nothing. Not envy, not pain, just distance. The kind that lets you finally breathe. When we left that night, the valet barely looked at our old car. My father didn't bother to say goodbye. He was too busy telling a story about his next merger, the kind that would make him untouchable. I remember the wind biting my face as Liam opened the passenger door. "Emma," he said, "we don't ever have to come back here." I looked back at the mansion glowing against the snow. "Oh, we will," I said quietly. "One day." He didn't ask why. Maybe he didn't want to know. That night I couldn't sleep. I sat by our apartment window watching the snow fall outside our tiny street. The radiator rattled like coins being furiously shaken in an empty jar, and the smell of coffee drifted up from the cafe below. Liam was asleep on the couch, still wearing his tie, one hand resting on his chest. We had $30 in our checking account and a pile of unpaid bills stacked like accusations on the table. But beneath the noise of our struggle, something inside me had shifted. I wasn't angry anymore. I was awake. I pulled out my old notebook, the one I used to sketch dream homes when I was a girl, and began writing something new at the top of a blank page. Phase 1, learn everything. I didn't know about corporate structures or investments, but I knew how to observe, how to listen, how to remember. My father had built his empire in the daylight, but I would build mine in the dark, brick by invisible brick, until one day the ground he stood on would quietly belong to me. Outside, the city glowed with Christmas lights. Somewhere out there, my father was probably raising another glass, laughing at the idea that his daughter had chosen love over wealth. He had no idea that night wasn't the end of my story. It was the beginning. I closed the notebook, whispering a promise to the empty room. They laughed tonight. Let them. Someday they'll bow. And with that, I turned off the light. The snow kept falling. The world kept spinning. But for the first time, I wasn't just surviving. I was planning. The morning after the banquet, the city felt quieter than usual, as if it too was exhausted from all the pretending. The snow from last night had turned to gray slush, and the streets below our apartment buzzed faintly with the hum of buses and early coffee drinkers. Liam was still asleep on the couch, his arm dangling over the side, the tie from last night loosened but not gone. He looked peaceful, unaware that something in me had already changed. I stood by the window with a cup of lukewarm coffee, staring at the skyline. My father's tower. Standing tall like a towering skyscraper, it used to make me feel small. Now it only reminded me of how temporary power could be when it was built on arrogance. The radiator clanged again. I set the coffee down and opened my laptop. The screen flickered to life, filled with tabs. I'd left open weeks ago articles on market trends, construction financing, and shareholder agreements. I didn't understand half the terms, but I understood hunger. The kind that didn't ask for food, but for transformation. By the time Liam woke up, I had already filled 3 pages in my notebook. Phase 1, learn. Phase 2, observe. Phase 3, build. He rubbed his eyes, sitting up slowly. Emma, you didn't sleep. I smiled faintly. I slept enough yesterday. Today's for something else. He frowned. Something else like what? Like not waiting anymore. He looked at the laptop screen, then back at me. You're serious about this? I've never been more serious in my life. He stood, walked over and kissed my forehead. Just don't lose yourself chasing them. I looked up at him, steady. I'm not chasing them. I'm building past them. He didn't ask another question. Maybe he saw it in my eyes, the resolve that had replaced every trace of hurt. That afternoon, I took the train to the city library. It was warmer there, the air filled with the smell of dust-old glue and the desperate hope of students. I sat in the finance section for hours, devouring everything I could: equity structures, private capital dynamics, foundations of modern holdings. Every page felt like a piece of armor. At one point, I noticed an older woman at the next table flipping through a book on mergers. She caught my glance and smiled. First time, is it that obvious? I asked. She chuckled softly. I used to be terrified of numbers. Then I realized they're just stories waiting to be told. What kind of stories? The kind where you decide who wins. Her words lingered. When I looked up again, she was gone, but she'd left her notepad behind. On it was scribbled a phrase in elegant handwriting: "Ours silent until it doesn't have to be." That night I copied those words into my notebook, underlined them twice. Weeks passed like that: work in the mornings at a small design firm, study at night, until my eyes burned. Liam picked up freelance projects to help with rent, always telling me, "You'll get there, Em. Just don't forget to rest." I didn't. Rest wasn't a luxury I could afford yet. By February, I had learned enough to understand how my father's empire worked and how fragile it really was. Every contract depended on credit lines. Every credit line depended on faith. If the wrong person stopped believing in Hayes Industrial, the whole thing could tilt. So I started drafting something else, a holding company of my own. Nothing visible, nothing traceable. I called it Northlight Holdings, after the way light always found a way through even the darkest corners. It existed only on paper at first, a few documents filed quietly under an attorney's name. But it was real. It was mine. At night when Liam was asleep, I'd sit by the window and trace the city skyline with my finger, whispering to myself the same words that had once humiliated me. Poor man, wrong choice, mistake. Then I'd smile. Every insult had become a blueprint. One evening as I was working, Liam came over with 2 mugs of tea. "You're building something again, aren't you?" "Always," I said. He nodded slowly. "Just promise me one thing." "What when it works, and I know it will?" "Don't forget why you started." I looked at him, the only person who'd ever believed in me without needing proof. "I won't," I said softly. "You're the reason I can." A week later, I got a call from an unknown number. Ms. Hayes, a clipped voice, said, "We received your application for incorporation. Congratulations. Northlight Holdings has been approved." I stared at the papers in my hand. My own name, my own company, my own beginning. When I hung up, I didn't cheer. I just sat there in silence, feeling the weight of something enormous and invisible shift inside me. That night I wrote my father's name on a scrap of paper. Then I folded it and slid it between the pages of my notebook. Not out of hate, out of reminder. Every empire starts with a name you refuse to forget. Outside snow began to fall again, softer this time, covering the city in a clean, untraceable layer, like a secret being sealed. Liam turned on the radio. A jazz melody filled the room, low and tender. I sat beside him, resting my head on his shoulder, pretending for a moment that I wasn't planning a quiet revolution. He whispered, half asleep, "You ever think your dad will see you for who you are someday?" I smiled into the dark. "Oh, he will," I said, "just not the way he expects." And somewhere deep down, I knew the truth. I didn't need to destroy my father's empire. I just needed to outgrow it. The radiator hissed again, the city breathing its tired winter breath, and for the first time in months, I felt warm. Tomorrow I will start making calls. Quiet ones. The kind that moved money like whispers and turned plans into power. But tonight, I closed my notebook and whispered one promise to the sleeping world: let them think I'm small a little longer. It makes the reveal sweeter. The snow kept falling. The city didn't know it yet, but the woman they'd all laughed at was already rebuilding the ground beneath their feet. The first thing I learned about power was that it hides best in plain sight. My father taught me that, though not in the way he intended. While he spent his days on magazine covers and business panels, I spent mine studying how men like him built walls so tall they forgot what was on the other side. It had been 3 months since the Christmas banquet. The snow had melted into muddy streets, and the air carried that strange in-between chill, like the silence before a market crash. My life hadn't changed much on the outside. Same tiny apartment, same leaky faucet, same coffee-stained desk. But inside, everything was shifting. By then, Northlight Holdings existed on more than paper. I'd opened a discreet account under a registered agent's name and started trading small at first. I wasn't chasing jackpots. I was studying patterns, watching how money moved, who blinked first when markets trembled, who waited long enough to win. At night, I pored over reports until my vision blurred. I learned to read numbers the way people read faces, every rise and fall revealing leverage, systemic risk, or quiet desperation. I wasn't betting. I was decoding. Liam would peek into the room sometimes, eyes soft but worried. "You sure you're okay?" "I'm fine," I'd say without looking up. "Just learning." He'd smile sadly. "That's what you said 3 nights ago." He wasn't wrong. Sleep had become optional. My notebooks multiplied, filled with scribbled equations, half-drawn graphs and fragments of thoughts that sounded like prophecies. Power is quiet until it doesn't have to be. I'd written that line at the top of every page, a reminder of why I was doing this. One night around midnight, my computer pinged with a message. It was from a private trading forum I'd been lurking on for weeks. Someone named Aurora7 had responded to a post I'd made about capital structures. Her reply was short but sharp. "You're asking the right questions. Most people never get that far. You want to learn how to see the current, not just the surface," I typed back. "Always." That's how it began. The messages turned into calls, the calls into mentorship. Aurora, who later told me her real name was Grace, was a quiet force somewhere between mystery and mathematics. She never bragged, never explained more than necessary. When I asked how she'd learned so much, she said only, "Failure teaches faster than professors." Grace taught me to look at companies the way surgeons look at X-rays beneath the skin. She showed me where debt hid, where egos lived, and where opportunities waited like buried gold. "Never follow the noise," she said once. "Follow the quiet." Sometimes I wondered who she really was. Her voice carried that mix of weariness and wisdom that only came from rebuilding something after it burned down. When I asked what she did before trading, she paused for a long moment. "I used to run a business," she said, "until someone decided I shouldn't." That silence told me everything I needed to know. By spring, Northlight had grown. Slowly, steadily. I wasn't rich, not yet, but I was dangerous. I had knowledge. I'd started acquiring small failing companies in industries no one cared about, local construction suppliers, niche logistics firms. I didn't need them to make profits. I needed them to be keys to other companies' back entrances. And one of those keys inevitably would lead back to my father. One evening I sat with Grace on a video call. Her face was dimly lit by the glow of her monitors. "You're playing a long game, Emma," she said. "You know that means patience." "I'm not after revenge," I said, though I wasn't sure if it was true. Grace smirked. "You're after justice. Don't confuse them. Revenge burns fast. Justice builds slowly." I wrote her words down and underlined them. Liam came home late that night, his clothes dusted with paint. He'd picked up a commission job renovating an old bookstore. Guess what he said, smiling? "They love the design. It's going to be beautiful when it's done." I smiled back, closing my notebook. "You're good at building things that last." He shrugged, leaning down to kiss me. "And you're good at building things no one can see. Until they can." He didn't know how right he was. A week later, while scrolling through market filings, I saw at Hayes Industrial, my father's company was quietly seeking new suppliers after a partnership collapse. The timing was perfect. One of my shell companies, Northlight Supply, could fit that role effortlessly. My heart pounded as I drafted the proposal. Not under my name, of course, under one of Northlight's subsidiaries. Every document signed. Every number is precise. When the email confirmation arrived, "Proposal accepted pending review." I stared at it for a long time. My father's company had just opened its doors to me. He didn't know it yet, but I was already sitting at his table again this time, not as the daughter he mocked, but as the unseen investor he'd soon depend on. That night I didn't celebrate. I walked to the rooftop of our building instead. The city shimmered below a patchwork of lights and ambition. Somewhere out there, my father was probably hosting another dinner, another toast to his success. I whispered into the night, "Keep laughing, Dad. I'm coming." The wind carried my words away, scattering them over rooftops like confetti. When I went back inside, Liam was asleep. Sketches scattered across his desk. I looked at him, the man who never asked for more than love, and I felt the sharp, cold knowledge that my ambition was built on a foundation he'd never approve of. I sat beside him, tracing his wrist with my finger, whispering softly, "I'll make it right. For both of us." Then I opened my notebook and wrote the next step in my plan. Phase 4, get inside. Stay invisible. The snow was gone. The city was waking up again. And for the first time, I wasn't the girl at the dinner table anymore. I was the unseen force in the room, the quiet power that no one saw coming. The first time I walked into Hayes Industrial again, no one recognized me. The lobby still smelled like polished wood and ambition, the same scent that used to cling to my father's suits when he came home late at night. I remembered being a child waiting by the stairs, listening to the echo of his shoes on the marble floor. That sound used to mean power. Now it meant target. Northlight Supply had been approved as a secondary contractor, just small enough to avoid scrutiny, just essential enough to stay close. I wasn't here as Emma Hayes, the disappointing daughter who married beneath her. I was here as E. Reed Operations Liaison for Northlight Holdings, a new identity wearing a new name. The receptionist smiled politely. "Mr. Grant will see you now." Mr. Grant, my father's vice president, was a sharp-aging man with eyes weary from decades of bowing. He'd worked for my father for decades, long enough to mirror his arrogance, though without the charm. His office was lined with plaques and photographs of papers being sealed in dark leather folders of smiles stretched thin by financial pressure. "Miss Reed," he said, motioning for me to sit. Northlight's proposal was impressive. Competitive pricing, fast turnaround. Hayes, Industrial appreciates that kind of initiative. "Thank you," I said evenly. "We pride ourselves on reliability." He nodded. "We'll start small. One contract for now. Logistics coordination, shipment analysis, and procurement audits. If it goes well, we'll talk about expansion." I kept my tone calm, neutral. "We're confident you'll be pleased." When I left his office, I didn't smile. The moment the elevator doors closed, I let out the breath I'd been holding. My reflection stared back from the steel surface hair pinned tight, black blazer, neutral lipstick. No trace of the girl who once cried at that banquet table. Outside, the city roared with late-morning traffic. I texted Grace. "We're in." Her reply came seconds later. "Good. Remember, watch first, move later." For weeks, I did just that. Observing, listening, learning. The data Northlight handled gave me quiet access to Hayes Industrial's operations. I saw everything my father didn't want the world to see: leaks, inflated costs, hidden debts. His empire wasn't the fortress he claimed. It was a web of fragile threads, held together by reputation and fear. Each report I processed told me a story. There were suppliers paid triple the rate for mediocre work, investors kept happy with false projections, projects funded through loans disguised as strategic partnerships. My father had built a house of mirrors, not marble. One evening I called Grace. "It's worse than I thought," I said. "He's running on borrowed time." Grace laughed softly. "Then let him. When you build a castle on sand, all it takes is one quiet tide." "I don't want him destroyed," I said before I could stop myself. "I just want him to see me." "That's the most dangerous kind of revenge," she said. "Because sometimes they never look until it's too late." Her words stayed with me. At home, Liam noticed the exhaustion in my eyes. "You're working too hard again," he said. "I'm just busy." With what I hesitated. "Consulting." He raised an eyebrow. For who I forced a smile. "A client who doesn't know what they're missing." He didn't push, but his silence felt heavy. There was always warmth between us, but lately it was layered with distance, like a half-erased pencil mark on a blueprint. The next day I was invited to a quarterly meeting at Hayes Industrial. Not as Emma, of course, but as Northlight's representative. When I stepped into that boardroom, every detail felt like a painful memory returning to haunt me. The mahogany table, the portrait of my father on the far wall, the faint scent of his cologne still lingering in the air. He wasn't there that day, but his presence filled the room anyway. His name sat embossed on the agenda, Daniel Hayes, CEO and founder, like a warning. As the meeting began, Mr. Grant introduced me. "This is E. Reed from Northlight. She's handling our new logistics integration." A few heads turned. Some nodded politely. One of the junior executives whispered, "New blood, finally." I presented data quietly, precisely: supply chain efficiencies, cost-saving projections, audit strategies. The room listened. Really listened. By the time I finished, the air had shifted. Mr. Grant leaned back. "Impressive work," he said. "We'll circulate this to the executive team." When the meeting ended, I gathered my notes, careful not to look up at that portrait on the wall. But before leaving, I let myself glance once. My father's eyes, calm, confident, cold, stared back from the canvas. "I'm coming, Dad," I whispered under my breath. Outside, rain had begun to fall, streaking the windows, obscuring the tower like a bad memory. I stood under the awning, clutching my folder. Somewhere across the city, my father was likely in another office. Shaking hands, smiling for cameras, never suspecting his newest partner was the same daughter he once called a disappointment. That night I met Grace at a quiet cafe near the docks. She wore a dark coat and gloves, her expression unreadable. "You did well," she said. "I haven't done anything yet." "You started." "That's everything." She slid a folder across the table. "You're about to get what you wanted, his attention. Hayes Industrial is bidding for a new construction project downtown. If Northlight plays it right, you'll end up in the same room." I looked down at the file, heart racing. "Face to face." She nodded. "Just remember, control isn't about what you say. It's about what you don't." Later that night, I couldn't sleep. I watched the rain blur the city lights through the window. Liam turned in his sleep beside me, murmuring something soft and kind. I reached over and touched his hand. "Almost there," I whispered. The next morning, I woke before dawn. I dressed in gray neutral, invisible, unreadable. My reflection in the mirror looked nothing like the girl from the Christmas banquet. As I tied my hair back, I thought of my father's favorite saying, "Only fools believe in silence." He was wrong. Silence wasn't weakness. It was the sound of strategy forming. When I left the apartment, the city was still waking. The air was crisp, the sky streaked with pink light. Somewhere in the distance, a bell chimed the hour. And with every step I took toward Hayes Industrial, I felt it power quiet and steady rising inside me like the unseen foundation being poured deep beneath the city's surface. My father's voice was the first thing I heard when I walked into the conference room. It had been over a year since the Christmas banquet, but that voice, smooth, commanding, sharp as polished steel, hadn't changed. "Let's not waste time," he said, tapping the table. "Efficiency is the mark of discipline." The words hit me harder than I expected. For a moment, my lungs refused to move. Then I straightened, stepped forward, and took my seat among the other contractors. Just another face in the circle of polished shoes and tailored suits. He didn't notice me. Not yet. Daniel Hayes looked like the empire he'd built, expensive, sharp-edged, and with no room for error. His silver hair was perfectly combed back, his cufflinks gleaming under the recessed lighting. Every move he made said one thing: control. "Let's begin with Northlight Holdings," said Mr. Grant. "Their proposal is the most cost-efficient." The room turned to me. My pulse slowed, almost calm. I'd rehearsed this moment in my mind 100 times, how I'd sound, how I'd look, what I'd allow him to see. I stood unfolding my notes. "Good morning, everyone. I'm E. Reed, Managing Operations at Northlight. Our proposal focuses on structural efficiency, material traceability, and long-term sustainability." My father barely looked up. He skimmed the first page of the packet and said flatly, "Numbers look good. Let's keep moving." That was him, always 3 steps ahead of the conversation, 2 steps behind empathy. But then something strange happened. Halfway through the presentation, he glanced up again. His eyes lingered on me, searching for a file name he couldn't recall before moving on. It wasn't recognition, more like familiarity scratching at the edge of memory. I kept my tone steady. As projected cost reduction over the next fiscal year would reach 15%, assuming procurement oversight transitions under Northlight's management. His hand froze over the page. "Northlight," he repeated. "Where did you say your headquarters are located downtown?" I said smoothly. "Piermont Street." He nodded slowly. "Interesting. I used to have an office there years ago." "Small world," I replied. He didn't smile. Neither did I. When the meeting ended, my father stood, shook a few hands, and walked toward the exit. As he passed, his gaze brushed mine again, brief, cold, curious. The kind of look you give a painting you don't remember owning. Once he was gone, Mr. Grant approached. "Congratulations," he said. "He liked your presentation." "Did he?" I asked. Grant smirked. "You'll know soon enough. He doesn't compliment. He tests." By the next morning, an email arrived from Hayes Industrial Northlight Holdings, shortlisted for primary contract pending direct review with CEO. I stared at the screen for a long time. My father wanted to see me again, this time across a negotiation table. He had no idea who he'd invited in. Grace called that night. "So the king noticed the unseen," she said. "He did." "Good. But remember, he's not your audience. Everyone watching him is. I don't want his approval." "You don't need it," she said softly. "You just need his attention long enough to take the floor out from under him." That night I barely slept. The past replayed in pieces, the laughter at the banquet, the taste of humiliation, the promise I'd made to myself that night, they'll bow. Now the stage was set. The next week, I met my father in his private office. It was larger than some apartments, floor-to-ceiling glass, a panoramic view of the skyline. Every inch of it screamed authority. He stood by the window, his back to me. "Miss Reed," he said, "I've heard good things." "Thank you, Mr. Hayes." He turned, then eyes sharp, measuring. "You look familiar. Have we met before?" My heart skipped once. The mask held. I didn't let the air move in my lungs. "I don't believe so," I said evenly. "Strange," he murmured. "You remind me of someone I used to know. A mistake, maybe." He smiled faintly, the kind that never reached his eyes. We went over numbers, contracts, timelines. Every question he threw, I caught. Every challenge I met with precision. It was like playing chess with the person who taught you the rules, but this time you've rewritten the board. By the end of the meeting, he looked almost impressed. "You're sharp," he said. "I like that. Northlight might be exactly what we need." "I appreciate your confidence," I said, standing to leave. "Confidence isn't free," he said. "Deliver results and you'll earn it." As I turned to go, he added, "You have a strange way of looking at people, Miss Reed. Like you already know their story." "Maybe I just listen better than most," I said. Outside, the silence in the elevator was the only thing pounding in my ears. The doors closed, sealing E. Reed into the mask. My reflection stared back, calm, collected, victorious. Downstairs, the city glittered with afternoon sunlight. I walked through the revolving doors into the street, my heels clicking against the marble floor, the same rhythm I'd once listened for as a child. That night I met Liam for dinner at a small cafe near the river. He looked tired, paint smudged on his hands. "You've been distant," he said softly. "I'm just busy." "With what work?" He looked at me for a long time. "You used to talk about your dreams like they were alive. Now you talk about them like they're numbers." His words were the only real thing I'd heard all day. I wanted to tell him the truth, but the mask wouldn't crack. When he left for the restroom, my phone buzzed. "Grace again, well done. Phase 2 complete. You're inside the gate now." I looked out the window, the river reflecting the city lights like a fractured mask. Inside that fractured surface, I saw two versions of myself, the girl who wanted to be seen and the woman who learned that power was better earned in silence. By the time Liam came back, I was smiling again. "I'm fine," I told him. "Really?" He reached for my hand. "I just miss the version of you that used to laugh." "She's still here," I said, though I didn't believe it. When we walked home, the night air smelled like rain and change. The world felt like it was holding its breath. Back in our apartment, I opened my notebook and drew a line through the words, Phase 4. Then I wrote beneath it, Phase 5, take the chair. Outside, thunder rolled across the city, low and distant. I looked toward the skyline where my father's tower stood, unaware that I now held the blueprint to bring them down brick by brick, quietly, beautifully, and without ever raising my voice. The first crack appeared on a Tuesday. No thunder, no warning, just a simple email that would quietly shift everything my father had built. It came from an auditor, copied to half the executive team, flagging unexplained discrepancies in project funding, the kind of discrepancies that could turn trust into panic. I read it before he did. Northlight's quiet access gave me that advantage. The email wasn't mine, but the information that led to it was. I'd left breadcrumbs, nothing more, just enough for someone inside to start asking the right questions. By noon, the building buzzed with tension. Executives whispered in hallways, the elevators ran slower, and assistants spoke in clipped tones. Fear has a sound when it moves through walls. It hums like electricity before a storm. From my office, 2 floors below the executive suite, I could hear the vibration of chaos above me. It was working. At 4, Mr. Grant called me up. "Miss Reed, the CEO, wants a meeting. Now." The elevator ride felt endless. The mirrored walls caught my reflection, poised, controlled a stranger I'd spent a year becoming. When the doors opened, my father was standing at the end of the corridor, looking out over the city like an investor watching a volatile stock ticker. "Come in," he said without turning. His office was darker than usual. The blinds were half drawn, the air thick with the scent of stale coffee and the metallic tang of stress. Papers lay scattered across his desk. For the first time, he looked human, less like a monument, more like a man trying to hold the sky from collapsing. "Tell me," he said, gesturing at the screen behind him. "What do you see?" Numbers scrolled across the monitor: cash flow statements, vendor invoices, red highlights, marking inconsistencies. "I see errors," I said carefully. "Maybe intentional." "Intentional," his jaw tightened. "Someone's feeding false data. I want to know who. I'll review the files I offered." Quietly. He nodded. "Do it. And Reed, don't discuss this with anyone, especially not Grant." It took everything in me not to smile. He was starting to distrust his own men. The tower was trembling and the cracks were growing wider. That night I went home late. Liam was asleep on the couch, again, a paintbrush still in his hand. The soft hum of the heater filled the silence. I knelt beside him, brushing a strand of hair from his forehead. For a moment I forgot about power and numbers and empires. I remembered love, the kind that asked only for presence, not power. Then my phone buzzed. "Grace." "He's taking the bait, yes," I typed. "He's looking inward now." "Good. Don't push too fast. Pride will finish the job for you." I put the phone down and stared at Liam again. "Don't forget why you started," he told me once. I wondered if I already had. By the end of the week, whispers had turned into panic. Grant had been suspended pending investigation. The board demanded answers. My father gave speeches about stability, confidence, transparency, all the words men use when they realize their reputation has finally exceeded their liquidity. He called me into his office again. "You've been thorough, Miss Reed," he said, rubbing his temples. "You're the only one around here who isn't incompetent." "I try to be useful," I replied. "You're more than useful. You're dangerous." Our eyes met for the first time with equal weight. I could see it now, the flicker of déjà vu he dismissed as exhaustion. "Do I know you?" he asked suddenly. My throat tightened. "Only through my work." He studied me for a long moment. "You remind me of someone. My daughter, maybe." She had that same defiance in her eyes. My pulse quickened. "And what happened to her?" He looked away. "She made her choices." "Did she?" I asked softly. He didn't answer. When I left his office, I stood for a long moment in the hallway, letting the air settle. I felt it then, not triumph, not satisfaction, but something heavier. The kind of ache that comes from realizing the person you wanted to beat has already been beaten by life itself. Downstairs, I passed a group of employees murmuring near the break room. "Did you hear the audit might go public? Stock's already dropping. Mr. Hayes looks different, older." By Friday, Hayes Industrial was on the front page of the business section. Audit raises questions over internal oversight. My father's face stared back from the paper, composed but strained. The cracks were now visible to everyone. That night I met Grace at the same cafe by the docks. Rain beat softly against the window. She slid a newspaper across the table. "You did it," she said. "No," I replied quietly. "He did." She tilted her head. "Regret looks strange on you." "It's not a regret." "Then what is it?" "Recognition," I said. "He built his empire under control. I built mine on silence. Maybe we're not that different." Grace smiled faintly. "You learned well. But you need to decide what kind of ending you want. Revenge always ends twice, once when they fall, and once when you do." When I got home, Liam was waiting by the window staring at the rain. "You're somewhere else lately," he said. "I'm right here." "No, you're not. You're in some war I can't see." I turned away. "It's almost over." He shook his head. You say that like it'll fix something. I didn't answer. Later, while he slept, I stood by the window again, the city lights flickering like the final desperate bids on the market floor. My phone buzzed with a new message from Grace Phase 5. He'll call you tomorrow. Be ready to step in. I looked out at the skyline at the tower, with my father's name glowing against the night. For so long I'd dreamed of watching it burn. But now standing there, I wondered if I was the one holding the match, or if I had merely swapped his prison for my own. The rain kept falling steady and relentless, washing the streets clean. Somewhere inside that tower, my father was probably staring out another window, trying to understand how the cracks had found their way in. And maybe for the first time, he was finally beginning to feel what I had felt that Christmas night, small, exposed, and powerless. The tower trembled, and I waited for the sound of it breaking. The morning it happened, the sky was the color of a defaulted balance sheet, flat, heavy, almost deliberate. I woke before dawn, not because of the alarm, but because silence itself felt different. The kind of silence that comes right before something collapses. By the time I reached the office, the air was thick with whispers. Screens flashed, red phones rang endlessly. Assistants ran in and out of conference rooms, clutching folders they no longer understood. Hayes Industrial. My father's empire was unraveling in real time. I didn't have to ask what caused it. The audit report had leaked. Every inflated invoice, every forged contract, every loan masked as profit, it was all out in the open now. The news spread like fire through dry grass. When I stepped off the elevator, I saw him standing in the hallway. Daniel Hayes, my father. He wasn't wearing his suit jacket, his tie hung loose, and for the first time in my life, he looked like someone who didn't know what to do. He turned when he heard my footsteps. Read, he said, his voice rough. Close the door. I obeyed. Inside his office, papers covered the desk like battlefield debris. You've seen the headlines, he asked, though it wasn't a question. Yes. Then you know what they're saying. I do. He slammed his palm on the desk, the sound muffled by scattered paper. It's sabotage. Someone's been feeding the auditors false data. You've been inside the systems. You've seen the files. Find out who did this. I can look, I said evenly. Look, he laughed, a dry, bitter sound. You think I'm asking, I'm telling you. You work for me. The words hit harder than he knew. You work for me. I'll find what you need, I said quietly. He nodded, already pacing again. When this is over, I'll rebuild. I always do. I tilted my head. And what if you can't? He stopped walking. The air between us turned to ice. Excuse me, what if it's not meant to be rebuilt? What if it's meant to end? His jaw tightened. You sound like my daughter. I met his gaze. Maybe she was right. He stared at me for a long moment, something shifting behind his eyes. Recognition, disbelief, anger. But before he could speak, the phone on his desk rang. He turned away, answering with his usual command. This is Hayes. I left before he could stop me. Outside, the hallway buzzed with chaos. Employees were whispering words like resignation, liability, lawsuit. Power moves fast when it's rising, but it falls faster when the foundation cracks. By noon, the board had convened an emergency meeting. I was called in as a consultant, sitting quietly at the far end of the long glass table, while the men who once worshipped my father now appraised him like a failing asset. We can't contain this, one of them said. The investors are pulling out. The press already has a second audit. My father slammed his fist on the table. I built this company from nothing. Exactly, another replied coldly. And you'll end it the same way if you don't step down. He looked around the table, his empire shrinking before his eyes. You think you can run this without me? No one answered. Silence said enough. Finally, the chairman spoke. Daniel, the board's decided. You'll resign effective immediately. For the good of the shareholders. I watched the words hit him like stones. For a moment, he didn't move. Then he straightened his back, his pride trying to wear its last armor. You'll regret this, he said quietly. None of you can do what I did. The chairman sighed. That's the point. When the meeting ended, He walked out first, brushing past me without looking. But in that instant, as his shoulder grazed mine, I felt it the empire he'd carried on his back for decades finally sliding off, leaving only the terrifying weight of nothing at all. Later that evening, I stood outside the building as reporters gathered like crows. Cameras flashed microphones, waved questions fired like bullets. "Mr. Hayes, are you resigning? Did you falsify the audits? Is it true? Northlight Holdings will take over the contract." He pushed through them silently, ignoring every word. But as he reached the car, one reporter shouted, "Mr. Hayes, how does it feel to lose everything?" He stopped. For just 1 second, he turned and looked straight at me. He didn't say anything. But in that silence, I saw it all: recognition, fury, heartbreak. He knew. When he finally got into the car and drove away, the flashlights reflected off the wet pavement like coins scattering from a burst vault. I stood there for a long time, the cold biting through my coat, the city roaring around me. It was over. The king had fallen. Grace called later that night. "Congratulations," she said. "You've done what most people only dream of." "It doesn't feel like a victory," I said. "That's because real victories don't leave you clean." After I hung up, I went to the balcony. The air smelled of rain and endings. Below, the city pulsed with its usual indifference: taxis, streetlights, people rushing home to lives untouched by mine. Liam came up behind me, wrapping his arms around my waist. "You did it," he whispered. I didn't turn. "No," I said softly. "I just finished what he started." He kissed the back of my neck. "Then what now?" I looked out over the skyline at the building that still bore my father's name in bright white letters. The shell was empty. "Now," I said softly. "Now I decide which name goes up next." Somewhere in the distance, thunder rumbled again, and for the first time in years, I realized the storm wasn't coming anymore. It had already passed. The headlines hit the next morning. Hayes Industrial collapses after internal audit scandal. CEO Daniel Hayes resigns amid financial misconduct allegations. His photo was everywhere: gray suit, tired eyes, the faintest trace of disbelief frozen mid-frame. I read every word over coffee I didn't taste. Liam was still asleep in the other room, unaware that the man who'd mocked me for marrying beneath my station had just lost the ground beneath him. The apartment felt too quiet, like a tidy room being messed up with clutter. For years, I'd dreamed of this day: the public fall, the poetic justice, the moment his empire finally cracked wide open. But standing there barefoot on the cool tile, all I felt was the weight of silence pressing against my chest. My phone vibrated. "Grace, you did it." I stared at the message for a long time before replying. "It doesn't feel like victory." It never does. Power doesn't end, it changes hands. You just became the one holding it. By noon, every news outlet in the city had turned his downfall into a spectacle. The news anchors analyzed the data. Journalists searched the rubble, and analysts calculated the final damage of the collapse. What they didn't know was that I already had. At 4 p.m., I was sitting in a conference room downtown, signing papers that officially merged my holding company with the remnants of his. The boardroom smelled faintly of lemon polish and exhaustion. The lawyers' voices were low, professional, detached. "Congratulations, Ms. Reed," one of them said when I finished the last signature. "You're now the majority owner of Hayes Industrial." I nodded the words, feeling strangely hollow. When I stepped outside, the wind cut cold against my face. Across the street, a group of reporters huddled under umbrellas, waiting for anyone connected to the scandal. I pulled my coat tighter and kept walking unnoticed. It was better that way. That evening, I drove to the outskirts of the city, the house where I'd grown up, where everything had started. I parked down the street and sat there for a long time, watching the porch light flicker in the winter dusk. He was home. I could see his shadow move past the window, slow and heavy. For years, I'd imagined standing in that doorway, triumphant, finally free of his judgment. But now, I couldn't even bring myself to knock. Because standing there, I realized the victory wasn't in proving him wrong, but in needing his judgment no longer. Instead, I sat there, hands on the steering wheel, and remembered the last Christmas banquet, the laughter, the condescension, the moment his words had sliced through me like frost. A poor man will only drag you down. He hadn't known that the company he bragged about would one day be mine. He still didn't know. My phone buzzed again. Liam. Dinner, I miss you. I typed later. I just need to think. When I finally drove away, the porch light was still glowing. It felt like a heartbeat that refused to die. The next morning, the newspapers had moved on. The world always does. My father's story had already begun to fade from the headlines, replaced by newer scandals, fresher names. But the damage remained. Employees laid off, contracts frozen, investors scrambling. I met with my legal team in the new office, his office now mine. The nameplate on the door had already been changed. Emma Reed, CEO. It didn't feel real. Grace called during the meeting. "You should smile," she said. "This is the moment you've earned." I thought it would feel different, I admitted. It never feels like revenge when you win. It feels like relief. I don't feel relieved either. Then maybe you're finally ready for peace. After the call, I stood by the window staring down at the city. The view was the same one my father had once claimed as his kingdom. Skyscrapers glittered in the distance, cold and perfect. He'd built this empire with fear. I'd taken it back with silence. But now that I held it, I didn't know what to do with the emptiness it left behind. At sunset, I drove to the construction yard, one of the few sites still running under emergency contracts. Workers moved quietly under the orange glow of floodlights. The smell of dust and steel hung thick in the air. "Ms. Reed," a foreman called. "Didn't expect to see you here." "I just wanted to understand what's left," I said. He nodded. "We're doing our best. Most of the team's been through hell. They still believe in this place." I looked around the cranes, the unfinished steel frames, the cold, hard geometry of work that needed to be completed. They still believe in this place. Maybe that was enough reason to rebuild. Not for pride, not for vengeance, but because something good might still exist underneath all the wreckage. That night when I got home, Liam was waiting by the door. He didn't say anything, just looked at me with quiet understanding. "I thought this would make me happy," I whispered. "And it didn't." He nodded. "Maybe it wasn't supposed to. Maybe it was supposed to make you free." I exhaled, leaning into him, the weight of years finally slipping off my shoulders. Later, as I lay awake beside him, the city lights flickering through the curtains, I thought about my father again, alone in that house, surrounded by the empty shells of everything he'd built. I could have hated him forever. But I didn't. Not anymore. Because the truth was simple. I had already won. And sometimes winning doesn't mean standing over the ashes. It means choosing a new foundation far from the heat of the old battle. The call came on a gray Thursday afternoon when the city sky looked like cheap watercolor and the rain tapped soft against the glass of my office. I was reviewing a report on the restructuring of Hayes Industrial. My company now, though the name still felt like a scar when my phone buzzed. Unknown number. I almost ignored it. But something made me answer. "Emma Reed," a familiar voice said, trembling slightly. My heart stopped. "Dad." There was a pause so long I thought he'd hung up. Then came the faint sound of his breath, rough and uneven. "I wasn't sure you'd pick up." "I almost didn't." I can imagine he said, his voice low. "I just wanted to say, I know what you did." I leaned back in my chair. "Which part?" He let out a dry, humorless laugh. "You always had your mother's wit. You know exactly what I mean. The holding company. Northlight. It was you all along." The silence that followed stretched thin tight like a rope pulled past its breaking point. I said nothing. "I should be angry," he continued. "I should hate you for it. But I can't." I swallowed hard. "Then what do you feel?" "Pride," he said, his voice catching. "And shame. Both, I think." My chest tightened. "You're not proud, Dad. You're just surprised I did what you couldn't." "That too," he admitted. "You were right. I built this family on arrogance, on control, and it cost me everything." I wanted to say it cost me too, but the words stuck in my throat. I didn't call to ask for forgiveness, he said. I know I don't deserve that. I called because the lawyers told me something. They said you left my name on the company charter. You didn't have to. I know. Why? Because I said quietly, you were right about one thing. Blood matters, even when it hurts. He didn't speak for a long time. I heard a faint sound, maybe wind, maybe him exhaling through the weight of everything left unsaid. I don't know what to do now, he whispered. I've lost the house, the cars, the friends. Your brother won't speak to me. I don't even know how to start again. You start small, I said. You build something honest. This time maybe without crushing anyone beneath it. He gave a small broken laugh. Honest. That's new for me. Then it's about time. When the call ended, I stared at my phone for a long time, watching the reflection of my own face on the dark screen. For years I'd fantasized about this moment, the apology, the collapse, the reversal of power. But it didn't feel triumphant. It felt like standing in the wreckage of something I once wanted to love. Later that night I told Liam. He called, I said softly. Liam set down his paintbrush, and he said he was proud of me. That's something. It's nothing, I said quickly, then hesitated. Or maybe it's everything. Liam came closer. You forgave him, didn't you? I don't know, I whispered. Maybe forgiveness isn't a single thing. Maybe it's just choosing to seal the old wound. He took my hands in his paint, still drying on his fingers. Then stop bleeding, Em. You've already won. That night sleep wouldn't come. The city hummed outside, alive and indifferent. I walked to the window, pulling my robe tighter around me. Down below, the streetlights glowed on the wet pavement like coins dropped in a wishing well, suddenly worthless. I thought of him alone in some rented apartment, sitting in the dark, surrounded by boxes of awards, framed photos, and documents that represented a power that had vanished. And for the first time, I didn't see a villain. I saw a man who'd lost the scaffolding of his life only to realize the structure underneath had never been solid. The next morning, I called Grace. He reached out, I said. I figured he would, she replied. What did he want? Nothing. Just to talk. Then that's your real revenge, she said. You built something he can't destroy, and you didn't have to burn him to do it. I looked out the window again. It doesn't feel like revenge anymore. Because it's not, Grace said. It's transformation. Revenge is fire. But what you did, that's rebirth. For the rest of the day, I couldn't stop thinking about her words. That evening, I went to the construction yard again. The place was quieter now, rebuilt under new management, but still alive. I walked past the scaffolding, the scent of fresh wood and rain-soaked concrete heavy in the air. One of the workers recognized me. You're the new owner, right? The one who saved the company? Something like that, I said with a small smile. He nodded. My dad used to work here when Hayes ran the place. He said the man was tough, but he built things that lasted. I looked up at the half-finished structure, steel beams cutting across the sunset. He did, I said quietly. And maybe this time, it'll last for the right reasons. When I got home, Liam was on the porch, waiting with 2 cups of tea. You look lighter, he said. I think I finally stopped carrying him. He smiled, handing me the cup. Then maybe it's time to pick up your own tools again. We sat there in silence, watching the sky fade from gold to indigo. Somewhere in the distance, a church bell rang, slow and deliberate. And for the first time in years, I didn't feel haunted by his voice. I just felt still. The war was over. And this time, no one had to lose for me to win. Everyone talks about winning wars. No one teaches you how to live after one. I used to think peace was what came when the battles ended. But peace, real peace, is the life you rebuild in the silence that follows. It doesn't roar. It whispers softly like forgiveness. The sun was just beginning to rise over the California coast when I opened my eyes. The air smelled of salt and coffee. The waves outside inhaled and exhaled, a sound that finally felt like healing. I lived by the ocean now, in a house small enough to clean in an hour, and quiet enough that I could hear my own thoughts. I walked barefoot to the porch, wrapped my robe around me, and watched the light spill across the water. My phone buzzed with notifications, emails, meeting reminders, investment updates, but I didn't touch it. I didn't need to. For the first time in years, the world could wait. On the table beside me sat a leather journal worn at the corners. Inside were pages of names, numbers, and lessons written during nights when I was building an empire out of hurt. But lately the entries had changed. Instead of strategies, there were reflections. You don't win by proving you're strong. You win by no longer needing to. The ocean breeze picked up, carrying the sound of distant seagulls. Liam's voice called from the kitchen. "You're up early again?" "Habit," I said, turning to smile at him. He looked older now, calmer, grounded, as if the chaos of those years had never touched him. He poured 2 cups of coffee and joined me on the porch. "You've got the foundation's meeting at 9, he reminded me. "I know, but they can start without me." He grinned. "You've changed, Em." "I had to," I said quietly. "You can't live in battle mode forever." The Hayes Foundation had become my new work, a nonprofit that funded education and career training for women rebuilding their lives after divorce, bankruptcy, or abuse. We started with 5 members. Now there were hundreds. Every week, women came to our workshops ready to lay their own foundations. I liked to meet them face to face, to see the light come back into their eyes when they realized their story wasn't over. It reminded me of the woman I used to be, the one standing in her father's shadow, trying to find her worth in the reflection of someone else's power. Later that morning, I drove into town for the foundation's open house. The office was bright and modest, filled with laughter and the smell of cinnamon rolls one of the volunteers had baked. A group of women sat around a table reviewing small business grant applications. "Morning, everyone," I said as I walked in. Heads turned. Smiles followed. "Ma, you made it," a woman named Carol exclaimed. She had gray streaks in her hair and an energy that filled the room. "We were just talking about the mentorship program. The new recruits are incredible." I nodded. "That's the goal. Build what lasts." In one corner, a young woman stood nervously with a folder clutched to her chest. She couldn't have been more than 25. Her name was Nora, and she reminded me painfully of myself at that age, determined but terrified. "You're Emma Hayes, right?" she asked shyly. "I mean Reed." "I used to be both," I said with a small smile. "Now I'm just Emma." She hesitated. "My dad, he says women shouldn't start businesses. Says they always fail." I felt a flicker of something deep in my chest, old but familiar. Mine said the same thing once I told her. So I built one anyway. Her eyes widened. "And did you prove him wrong?" I looked out the window at the ocean beyond the street. Eventually, I stopped needing to. She smiled, then the kind of small, brave smile that made the whole room warmer. After lunch, I drove to the university auditorium, where I'd been invited to speak at a conference called Women in Finance. The stage lights were a focused beam. The silence in the auditorium was a weight I knew how to carry. When I stepped up to the microphone, I looked out at hundreds of faces, students, professionals, women from every walk of life. My father once told me, I began that no man wants a woman who earns more than he does. He thought money was controlled. I thought money was freedom. Turns out we were both wrong. Power isn't about money at all. It's about peace, the kind that comes from knowing you don't need to prove yourself to anyone. There was a hush, the kind that happens when truth lands exactly where it needs to. "I used to think revenge was my victory," I continued. "Now I know it was only the beginning. Because revenge changes what you have. Forgiveness changes who you are." When the applause came, it wasn't loud. It was steady like rain. And that felt right. That night after the conference, I drove to the lighthouse on the cliffside, a place I visited whenever I needed to think. It has become my sanctuary. The sea below shimmered under the full moon, vast and indifferent to my past power struggles. I sat on the rocks, the sound of the waves filling the silence, and pulled out a small envelope I'd been carrying for months. Inside was a letter I'd written to my father but never sent. "I don't hate you anymore," it began. "You taught me what power looks like when it's loud." but I learned to love what it sounds like when it's quiet. I folded it carefully and tucked it into the pocket of my coat. Some letters don't need to be mailed. Some are meant only to be written. When I stood, I could see the horizon turning gold again, the same color it had been the morning I first drafted the blueprint. Only now I wasn't fighting. I walked back toward the car, feeling the sand shift under my shoes. Liam was waiting by the door when I got home, the porch light glowing behind him. "How was the speech?" he asked. "Honest," I said. "Finally." He kissed me softly. "You did good, Em." "I didn't do it for them," I said. "I did it for me." Later, lying in bed, I listened to the rhythm of his breathing and the distant crash of waves. I thought of my father somewhere far away, maybe still trying to piece his life back together. I hoped he found his peace too. Because peace isn't something you win. It's something you let in. And after all the noise, all the battles, all the silence, I finally had. The morning the letter arrived, the sky was silver soft and still, the kind of light that seemed to erase the hard edges of memory. It came in a plain white envelope addressed in handwriting I didn't recognize. There was no return address, no company logo. Just my name written carefully across the front, Emma Reed. I almost didn't open it. I'd stopped expecting anything from the past. But when I slid my thumb under the seal, a familiar scent drifted out, old paper and cologne. My father's cologne. Inside was a single page. Emma, you don't owe me anything. Not forgiveness, not a visit, not even your time. I just wanted to tell you I finally understand what you were trying to teach me. I built walls and you built bridges. I thought I was protecting our name. I was only protecting my pride. If you ever find it in your heart to see me, I'll be here where it all began. Dad. I sat there for a long time, the words trembling slightly in my hands. He hadn't written love, but somehow it was still there between the lines. The drive to our old neighborhood took less than an hour, but it felt like crossing years. The streets were smaller than I remembered, the houses quieter, the trees older. His old house was gone, sold long ago to cover debts. In its place stood a modest bungalow with peeling paint and a front porch that leaned slightly to one side. He was sitting there waiting. No suit, no cufflinks, just a cardigan and the same steel-gray hair, softer now, streaked with white. When he saw me, he stood too quickly, like a man trying to recall the proper way to greet a long-lost guest. "Emma," he said, breath-catching. "You came. I got your letter." He nodded, looking down, his hands shaking slightly. "I wasn't sure you'd read it. I almost didn't." We stood in silence for a moment, the air between us filled with all the words we'd never said. Finally, he gestured toward the porch. "Sit. I made coffee." The cups were mismatched. The table was scratched. But it felt more real than any of the dinners we'd ever had in the mansion. He watched me quietly for a while before speaking. "I keep thinking about that night, the Christmas banquet. I wanted everyone to see me as powerful. I didn't care who I hurt to prove it. I remember I said softly." His eyes filled with something fragile. "You looked just like your mother when you stood up to me." She had that same look, steady, defiant kind. I didn't know how to handle it, so I mocked it. The breeze stirred between us. I didn't know whether to comfort him or let him drown in the memory. "Why now, Dad?" I asked finally. He sighed. "Because I realized I spent my whole life chasing things that never loved me back. And by the time I saw what mattered, it was already gone." I looked at him, and for the first time I saw not the man who'd humiliated me, but the man who'd been stripped of his armor and finally found cold. "I'm not angry anymore," I said quietly. "You taught me something, even if you didn't mean to." He smiled faintly. "That's more than I deserve." We sat there until the light changed the shadows stretching long across the yard. When I stood to leave, he reached for my hand. "Emma," he said softly, "if I could do it all over again," I stopped him. "You can't. But you can start over now." He nodded, tears catching in his lashes. "You sound like your mother." Driving home, the world felt lighter, as if the shard of crystal I'd carried since the banquet had finally dissolved. I didn't feel victorious or redeemed, just at peace. That weekend, the foundation hosted its annual gala. It wasn't glamorous, just an evening filled with stories, women who had rebuilt their lives, mothers who'd started small businesses, daughters who no longer apologized for taking up space. I watched them laugh and hug and speak with pride, and I realized this was what legacy looked like. Not money, not power. Impact. During the final speech, Carol handed me the microphone. "Tell them what this was all for," she said, smiling. I looked out at the room, faces glowing with hope, and took a breath. "This was for every woman who was told she wasn't enough," I began. "For every daughter who was silenced, every wife who was underestimated, every mother who had to start again. You are not the sum of what you've lost. You're the proof of what can be rebuilt." The room erupted in applause. Somewhere in the back, I thought I saw my father just for a second, a faint shape in the shadows smiling. Maybe it was my imagination. Or maybe he'd come after all. Later that night, after the guests had gone, I stood on the terrace overlooking the water. Liam joined me, slipping his arm around my waist. "How does it feel?" he asked softly, "to be done?" I smiled. "I'm not done. I'm just beginning differently." He kissed my temple. "You sound happy." "I am," I said. "But it's a quiet kind of happiness." The moon hung low over the ocean, reflecting in ripples of silver. I closed my eyes and listened, the laughter fading inside the waves below, the faint echo of a life I'd finally made peace with. When I opened them again, I whispered to no one and everyone, "Thank you, Mom. Thank you, Dad. You both gave me everything I needed, even the pain." The wind carried the words away, scattering them like seeds. As we walked back inside, Liam stopped by the door. "You know," he said, smiling, "for someone who once declared war on her family, you've built one hell of a legacy." I laughed quietly. Maybe that's what redemption really is, learning how to build love out of the rubble. He reached for my hand, and honest work out of the ruins. I squeezed his fingers, the sound of the waves whispering against the shore, steady and eternal. For the first time in a long time, I wasn't looking back. Tomorrow I'd wake up and begin again, not as the daughter who was mocked, not as the woman who fought for revenge, but as someone who had finally learned how to live without armor. And that I realized was the real inheritance. I found the letter again on a quiet Sunday morning, tucked inside the back cover of my old notebook, the same one that held my first plans for Northlight Holdings. The paper had yellowed slightly, the ink faded around the edges. I'd written it the night my father's company fell, intending to send it once I'd won. But I never did. I wasn't ready then. Maybe I am now. I sat by the window, sunlight spilling across the floor, and unfolded it carefully. My handwriting was sharper than deliberate angry, the kind of script that belonged to a woman still trying to prove something. "Dad, you told me once that power was controlled. You were wrong. Power is knowing you can destroy someone and choosing not to. Power is walking away." I smiled faintly. That version of me, the one who wrote those words, was all fire and steel. She built her own throne out of spite. But reading it now, I didn't feel anger. I felt gratitude. Because without the storm she carried, I'd never have found the calm I live in now. The house was quiet except for the faint hum of the waves outside. Liam was in the garden planting the first row of wildflowers we decided to grow along the fence. He'd been talking about adding color to the house for months. "It needs life," he'd said, "not just structure." He was right. I poured myself coffee and looked at the stack of mail on the table, foundation updates, thank you notes from donors, a handwritten card from Nora, the young woman who'd once told me her father didn't believe in her. She'd written, "I got the loan. My shop opens next month. You changed my life." I set it aside and looked back at the letter in my hand. My father died 3 weeks ago. Heart failure, the doctor said. Quick, peaceful. I'd attended the funeral, stood by the casket, and said nothing. There were polite condolences, the kind reserved for complicated relationships no one understood. People whispered about legacy and family, but all I saw was a man who'd finally put down the armor he'd carried too long. Afterward, I went home and slept for 12 hours straight. When I woke up, I didn't cry. I didn't even feel hollow. I just felt done. Now, sitting by the window with that letter in my hand, I realized I'd already said everything that needed to be said. But I finished reading anyway. You made me small so you could feel tall. You laughed when I fell because you believed falling was permanent. But I learned something you never did. Every fall teaches you where the ground is, and every time you rise, you do it stronger. I don't need your validation. I don't even need your apology. I just need you to understand that you didn't break me. You built me. The final line made me close my eyes for a moment. The woman who wrote that had been ready to fight forever. The woman holding it now finally knew how to rest. Liam came inside, dirt on his hands, a streak of sunlight across his face. "You okay?" he asked gently. "Yeah," I said, glancing at the letter. "Just found an old memory." He smiled softly. "Friendly one, I hope." "Eventually," I said. He poured another cup of coffee and joined me at the table. "You've done a lot of good, you know. The foundation, the scholarships. Your father might not have understood you then, but he'd be proud now." "I think he finally was," I said. "In his own way." Liam reached for my hand, squeezing it lightly. "So what happens now?" I looked out the window. The ocean shimmered like polished mercury. Now I live. No agendas. No revenge. Just life. He nodded. "That sounds perfect." That afternoon I drove to the lighthouse. It had become my quiet ritual, a place to leave things I wasn't meant to carry anymore. I brought the letter with me folded neatly in my pocket. The wind whipped through my hair as I climbed the worn stone steps. At the top, the sea stretched endlessly blue and eternal. I took a deep breath and opened the letter one last time. "Goodbye," I whispered, and let it go. The paper caught the wind fluttering once before drifting out over the water, spinning until it disappeared into the horizon. For a moment I just stood there, the salt air stinging my eyes, the sound of the waves a profound and simple affirmation. It wasn't sadness that filled me, it was clarity, the kind that comes when you finally understand that closure isn't a door slamming shut. It's a window opening. On the drive home, I took the long route along the cliffs. The radio played an old jazz song, one my mother used to hum when she cooked. I rolled down the window, let the wind tangle my hair and drove, realizing I wasn't racing anything anymore. When I pulled into the driveway, Liam was waiting with 2 glasses of wine. "You let it go, didn't you?" he asked. "I did," he smiled. "How does it feel?" "Like realizing I don't need the next chapter to define the last one." We stood on the porch, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in streaks of gold and violet. The wildflowers he'd planted swayed in the breeze, tiny bursts of color against the fading light. I leaned into him, resting my head on his shoulder. "You know," I said softly, "I used to think strength meant never breaking." "And now?" he asked. "Now I think it means knowing when to let the pieces fall." He kissed my hair. "You've always known, Emma. You just had to live it." The first stars began to appear, faint and shimmering above the ocean. Somewhere behind us, the foundation's lights twinkled in the distance, the life I'd built not out of revenge, but out of resilience. As the night deepened, I whispered the final words I'd never written in that letter. "I forgive you, Dad. I hope you found peace." I finally have. The waves rolled in slow and rhythmic as if answering back. And in that quiet under the starlit sky, I realized something simple and true: stories don't end when justice is served or when wounds are healed.